I feel like I should preface all of these by saying that if you are really intending to run a Dune game or play in a Dune game and do it proper justice, you need to ignore all the Brian Herbert stuff and only use the movies as kind of a common point of visual reference, but, kind of as much as you can, go to the original 6 books by Frank Herbert. The Bene Gesserit are arguably the most important faction in the entire human sphere of influence across the entire Dune timeline. They are not literal psychics, they are not literal witches. They play up on these stereotypes and fears and cultural superstitions, but anytime there is a mention of telepathy in the Frank Herbert books, they are not talking about literal telepathy where you're reading someone's mind from across the room or any of that stuff. What the Bene Gesserit are from a very young age, and somewhat reinforced by the fact that they are engaged in controlled breeding for certain characteristics and traits. They are super skilled yoga martial artists who are highly educated in politics and psychology and trained for, like reading people's nervous tics and voice usage and all that kind of stuff. So they can, basically deduce with a high degree of accuracy what someone's thinking or feeling and be able to use that then to manipulate them. The thing that the movies in particular always seem to get wrong is the concept of the witch's voice. It's not the thing done in the movies where it's all like, "Come over here and put your hand in my box, in my box, in my box." It's not that kind of stuff. It's just reading how someone carries themselves and talks, where you are able to figure out exactly what kind of tone and timbre to take with them, so that they will respond in the way that you want them to respond. That people who've had display the traits of someone who's had military conditioning. If you bark at them in just the right way, they'll instinctively react, and even if they might catch themselves a moment later. That you kind of played with them based on some sort of muscle memory almost, in terms of how they were raised and conditioned by parents, society, social status, profession. All sorts of different things can have those sorts of influences on people. The thing with the Bene Gesserit is they are, for the majority of the Dune timeline, you could describe them as operating as a shadow matriarchy. They've embedded themselves throughout the political system of the galaxy, but they do not openly rule it. They want to use males. There's a thing in Dune where there's kind of a false impression of a feudal patriarchy going on in the early half of it. But the Bene Gesserit are playing a long game of chess. They might have less impact on immediate things that are going on, but in terms of the long arc of history, they're guiding humanity towards a certain end. What that end was, we never get to see, because the whole thing was ruined by Jessica. The Bene Gesserit's hatred of Jessica, carried forward through forward history past the initial Dune books, is rather justified. Their entire breeding program leading up to the search for the Kwisatz Haderach was not supposed to end the way it ended. That bloodline was never supposed to be bred into with wild Fremen genes from some random sand tart that Paul picked up on Arrakis. Leto II was never supposed to exist, and Leto II both gave the Bene Gesserit everything they wanted, in a way, in the final picture of the known universe after his passing, but he also kind of set up the conditions so that they would find their ultimate demise. He certainly, during his long reign, would have had the time and power to wipe the Bene Gesserit out if he so chose, but he had carried so much of them within himself that I don't think he, could ever actually bring himself to do that sort of thing. But he certainly set things up so that centuries, millennia later, the Bene Gesserit's own offspring would kind of come back and wipe them out, take them over, turn them into their new version of themselves in the form of the honored matres. The thing that was actually like pushing into the realms of the superhuman with the Bene Gesserit is the internal alchemy that they eventually master. That's where they're able to take the poisonous bile of the sandworm and alter it chemically within themselves so that it transforms from being a poison into a hallucinogenic drug. That hallucinogenic drug, combined with their mental mastery over themselves, their muscles and their nervous systems, is what then also allows them to be able to, with physical contact, so that they can touch skin to skin and have some sort of neurological contact, that they can imprint chains of memories from other Bene Gesserit who are skilled in the same kind of thing, so that they can facilitate the transfer. That's getting kind of a bit into the realm of wonkiness in terms of how some things work. It's very speculative. The idea of the various schools of humanity, such as the Bene Gesserit, the Spacing Guild, the Bene Tleilax, and so on, is that in the wake of destroying all the computers, humanity didn't want to just go back to living in the Stone Age and still needed to maintain, an intergalactic economy and space travel, and some planets aren't, exactly perfectly balanced for human life, and so some kinds of technology have to be maintained in several places just for people to still be able to breathe and live and eat. So, the disciplines like becoming a mentat and all this other kind of stuff were developed to push human beings to their ultimate realistic limits. But a thing that is missed in the Brian Herbert books and in the movies is that they too often turn them into a literal translation of superhuman abilities. This is not a comic book. There is still a bounded limitation. Even the fancy stuff like Paul Atreides' prescience, in many ways, is just him performing like an extremely vast and complicated internal mathematic computation, just based on his ability to grasp a tremendously large amount of information points that are all happening at once that most people can't really juggle in their brain that well. Most people can only predict a very narrow path in front of themselves. It didn't really get supernatural seeming until you get to the point where, like, he, has his eyes burned out by the stone burner, and he's able to still see by just projecting his vision just a few seconds ahead of himself. That's starting to get like into a bit into the realms of the paranormal. But for the most part, the Bene Gesserit are not actually, like I said, they're not literally practicing magic. There is a kind of neurological basis. The idea that you can transfer memory through that kind of base level skin-to-skin contact does have some basis in reality. Consider how many prosthetic devices can be operated and controlled by a person, with an artificial arm. That it's not like being directly wired into their nervous system like some old 80s cyberpunk tech. It's just got a little touchpad on part of it that just touches your skin, and you just think about closing your hand, and it closes its hand. And so the idea that the Bene Gesserit can imprint their memories on each other is kind of like an extension of that same kind of phenomenon. But they're just undermined by the same kind of phenomenon of that's described in Isaac Asimov's Foundation novels of for all of Harry Seldon's ability to predict the future based on the patterns of psychohistory. You can't accommodate for the mules. Occasionally a random individual comes along and does things that cannot be predicted for, and for a brief moment has their thumb on the pulse of history and forever radically alters the trajectory that things were predicted for. And then the further out from that point of disturbance, the initial prediction model falls further and further apart, which is, I guess, part of why he had established an organization like the Foundation, so there might be some sort of potential for a corrective factor as those sorts of events happened. Dune the Bene Gesserit didn't quite ever have that. As much as they tried to maintain an effort to regain control over the breeding program, they never got there. So it had been under Leto II's control for so long, and because of the events of the scattering and the invention of no ships and the end of the Spacing Guild's hold over interstellar travel, as a monopoly. That was the end of the dream. There's no way to get that genie back in the bottle. You can never fully control for all the vectors again, in terms of trying to create a supreme being. And really all the supreme being is them looking for a male who is capable of doing the same internal alchemy without losing their maleness. If there is one thing that seems to be kind of a bit overlooked, and kind of oddly so, as much as the media, entertainment media, likes to jump on the problematic aspects of like old things when they're bringing them back, oddly there's been very little from like any magazine or anyone kind of like seemingly from what I've noticed who's kind of picked up on the fact that the Bene Gesserit are kind of a, well, to be frank, rather turf kind of concept. Like a transgendered woman is not able to be a Bene Gesserit, and that is not what they're looking for in a Kwisatz Haderach. So the Kwisatz Haderach is not a good analogy for that within the story. Really, the most evident aspect of transgenderism is in stuff like the Bene Tleilax and the Face Dancers. And even then, that's not quite the same as like what modern day transgenderism is, because Face Dancers start off as a non-binary, agendered creature that can just take either aspect and might start to imprint upon an aspect that they hold for too long over time. But, if you're playing Bene Gesserit or running Bene Gesserit, like most people are going to be doing it during sometime around the events of the first core trio of novels, I would imagine. If you're experimentative, you'll do the later stuff, though. So, during that time period, the Bene Gesserit are like a rule from the shadows. They have a heavy push on the decisions that the men in power will make, but they're not actually the ones making decisions. It does kind of also, though, kind of allow them to continue to operate in the shadows, because it's never actually their fault. They're just influencing things, but they're not the one who actually made the decision. Ironically, after Leto II is gone, and part of what I mean about how he did kind of give them what they wanted is after his death, the Bene Gesserit, were like one of the core influential powers of that original core set of the Empire after it had collapsed. There's still some hint to the Landsrad in the post-scattering times. Chom is still around. The Spacing Guild is still around. They're still, the most reliable, known, best branded, space service. But no ships are still there. They just seem to primarily now a military applied craft, because they do have obvious tactical resources. So the Spacing Guild is basically just shuffling cargo and passengers, but they're not quite so much in the army business anymore. But the Bene Gesserit are much more openly in control, and as a political power. And Leto had reshaped the galaxy to be one that is, largely openly run by females. The feudal patriarchy at the beginning of the Dune series is not where the Dune series ends. Albeit, though, there are some other, like, maybe warning messages of like, how the honored matres act, and that... female leadership of society does not necessarily lead to less war or anything along those lines, despite what some people might claim. That's all subject to interpretation, obviously. So, as I say, read the actual books. Don't just rely on the films or the stuff said in the Brian Herbert novels, or, unfortunately, this role-playing game, too. If this is your introduction to Dune, it's going to tell you things in the backstory that are going to kind of give you a kind of just more dorky, surface level science fiction and impression of what these books are actually about. You can learn a lot from Dune. You can learn a lot from Dune by rereading it periodically, because you always, as you grow older, pick up on things that you didn't really kind of pick up on the first time and all that kind of stuff. So anyway, those are my thoughts largely on the Bene Gesserit. Pull from that what you will for insight for how to run them or play them. And stay waspinated.